Okay, so good morning. Welcome, everyone, or good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you so much for joining us in the third of a four-part series that forms the Integrated Food Ontology Workshop. My name's Evan Griffiths. I'll be chairing the sessions today. I'm a research associate in the Shao Public Health Bioinformatics Lab at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And I'm very proud to say that I work with Damion on FoodOn. Now, whereas he is the brains of the operation, I am just a humble curator and user of the ontology.
Not true,
Um,
not true.
it's very true, very true. But that's why today's session is very dear to my heart. We work with a number of different Canadian as well as international public health and food safety agencies to help structure their data using FoodOn as well as other Obo Foundry ontologies. And this is to better enable data sharing and integration of their data for surveillance, outbreak investigations, and research. So the focus of today's session, as you probably know, is the operational implementation of food ontologies in the real world. So how agencies, organizations, and companies are using ontologies to document and make information more explicit, to model data, and to make data sets and information more interoperable across systems and databases. So today's talks will explore different types of considerations that standards and ontology developers need to think about when creating and implementing these standards and resources. Now, it's not just for research, but for activities that can really impact industry as well as human, animal, and environmental health. So thank you to all of our presenters who are here today and sharing your experiences with us. I know it's going to be a very informative and stimulating session. So before we get started, there's a little bit of housekeeping for everybody. We are going to be recording today's session. If you don't wish to be in the recording, we suggest that you keep your mic muted and to change your name in the chat. We will be pausing the recording for a few of the sessions because that has been requested previously. So the agenda for today is we are going to power through 5 different very excellent 10-minute talks. Then we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we're going to come back for an integrated question and discussion period. So I've already dropped it into the chat, but I will keep popping it in there every so often just to remind you to write down any of your burning questions during the talks. We don't want to lose track of those. And we are hoping to address them in the question period. We're also hoping to get some good crosstalk going so that we can synthesize ideas and hopefully stimulate some more as well. So speakers, in an effort to keep to time, I will give you a 1-minute warning when your 10 minutes is almost up. As I said before, I'm not going to cut you off mid-sentence, but please do your best to keep to time as much as you can. Everyone else will be good Zoom citizens and we'll keep our mics muted during the talks. But remember, as I said, you feel free to pop any questions in the chat, but also to pop them in the Google Doc for the integrated discussion period. So let's get down to business. We're recording, I guess, James.
Yep.
So we're all good to go. Great. And so our first speaker is Jessica Singer from Myra Analytics. Jessica works as a mathematical modeling engineer at Myra, creating traceability systems for crops. She's originally a bioresource engineer by training, but she designs and writes ontologies for both crops and agricultural operations. And Jessica will be telling us all about how you can't grow ontologies from bad soil today. So with that, Jessica, take it away.
Thanks for that so much for the introduction, Emma. Oops, it would help if I shared my screen, right? Can everybody see my screen?
Not yet.
Sorry, I have to update my permissions. Oh, this new Max. Okay, and Zoom, okay. Okay, I updated my privacy, so that should work.
Great, we can see it now.
Oh,
Perfect.
awesome. Okay, great. All right. Okay. So, hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Jessica Singer. I'm an engineer at Mara Analytics, where in a past project, we created a farm management and traceability system that is ontologically powered. It has now been bought out and no longer available, but we thought we'd look back at some of the hard-learned lessons from creating the system that might be interesting to you. The three main points I'd like to cover are the differences in nomenclature, context-sensitive description, and the bane of most engineers, getting the data into the system. First of all, the nomenclature. What is it? So many ontologies are focused on classes and not so much on instances, but we focus on those instances because that's what we're paid to check and that's what people really care about. There are different terminologies attributed to the same thing, depending on the context, which is why you don't see the scientific names for food at the grocery store. However, this is essential for regulatory documentation required for the packing industry. As you can see from the labels on a can of Green Giant's peaches and cream corn, the consumer name of this type of corn is Zea Maize SE bicolor type 1560, which is nowhere on the label because people want the consumer label. And don't even get me started on why it's called peaches and cream for corn. A study from Oceans Canada even found that 40% of fish is mislabeled, which is to the advantage of fisheries because there of the disconnect between the consumer label and what the actual product is. There are different levels of granularity needed for various stages of farm to fork, and occasionally a farmer only knows what he's planting, the variety, or what he's selling, the commercial term or grouping such as hard red spring wheat, which is all he really needs to know. Then when shipping the product, from a customs perspective, they don't really care what the shipment is exactly, just generally what it is, so they can apply the correct tariffs, which only goes as far as to durum or wheat. From a biosecurity perspective, they sometimes want to know what the variety is, such as hard red spring wheat, but it's not always the case. And finally, there's the scientific nomenclature, which has not kept up with all the new varieties that have been created. Shown here are the scientific terms for common durum and common wheat, and they are linked to the variety name, but the relationship is not one-to-one. Also, many products have not been genetically tested, so the same product that a family of farmers that have been planting for generations may no longer be what they initially planted. With a few generations of seeding the same thing and with winds carrying speeds from other fields, this can lead to genetic drift that the farmer is just simply unaware of. An average farm in Saskatchewan can produce about 100 megametric tons of product. So cross-contamination, genetic drift, and error become highly likely. This table has 6 entries that are all names for the same thing, wheat, that can be used in different contexts. Rather than being a tree graph, it's more of an interconnected web. So we need to be able to shift between labels depending on the context. And that's the beauty of ontologies, is that you can switch between these labels and the relationships that between them. And that's what makes them so useful, but so aggravating to model because of how interconnected and tangled they are. There can also be different names of the same thing in the same context as well. For example, this has 2 accepted vernacular names, corn and maize. But in the UK, corn means what we in North America call wheat. And that's fun. But this is why language and location tags come into play, because it makes it makes sure that the labels make sense to whoever is reading it. The same goes for trucks. Not to mention having to translate all of these names, which might not have one-to-one translations in multiple languages. And most of the time, these different labels are the result of cultural differences. And this is just a map of the United States. There is a need to adapt based on location. However, being too culturally sensitive may lead to the whole thing breaking down. Locale is just simply not enough. There's also the case of wrong terminology being ingrained in culture, and people don't like being told that they're wrong, and that people want to be right, and that the rest of the world just doesn't matter. So how do you approach these types of people? An example is that there was one particular farm that we dealt with that kept calling way bills of lading because they couldn't accept that those were 2 different documents. And they kept insisting that they were right. It caused a lot of problems operationally because their context wasn't the same as everybody else's. Having inconsistencies in nomenclature leads to complicated data entry that most people just don't want to deal with. This is a classic example of, I move my grain with my tractor. What does this mean? It's obvious to someone looking at these vehicles that they're all different. Shown here, you have a grain tractor trailer, grain truck, a tractor, and a grain cart. However, it's impossible to figure out since this is not obvious to somebody going through incomplete records. So what truck, which tractor, what was attached to it, how many compartments were there? Both the vernacular and trade vocabulary are just too imprecise. What's the difference between a field tractor and a grain tractor? Well, they're both tractors. Are you confused? Well, that's the point. This is what makes modeling this ontology so difficult. And for the farmers, this kind of data entry is a waste of time. Like, why do they care how I move my grain? Well, this is the kind of information that's needed for traceability to ensure there's no cross-contamination and for scheduling equipment. Overall, data entry is largely ad hoc, with the context kept mostly in people's heads. The weight of the grain stored and moved is often an eyeball estimate, and 2 metric tons is an easy error to make visually. Not to mention, it's imperative we know what the thing is because bushels are measured by crop and by volume and not by weight. So, and even within wheats, there are 2 different measurements that can be used depending on which wheat class is involved. And vehicles can have up to 2 trailers attached, each with 4 hoppers or storage compartments, sometimes with different farms piggybacking on the same load, because farmers like to do a lot of horse trading or swapping of materials that just go unrecorded. So then you have a situation where you have 8 factorial different combinations to choose from. So entering all that data is completely time consuming, and farmers push back since it's immediately obvious to the person on the ground. Do you have a situation where the person says, I can see it, but why can't the computer see it? A lot of forms such as bills of lading, weigh bills, and work orders are just free form. And that's a problem because this free form data needs to be re-engineered in order to be read by the computer. In another example, on a cleaning work order, there were checkboxes of yes, no, and not available for what was to be done to the grain. And when asked what not available meant, the cleaner simply stated that he had no idea why this was on the sheet, when this is a sheet that he's been using for years. And the person who wrote the forms just wasn't available, and so the things that didn't make sense just got ignored or crossed out. And this can be seen across the board. This is a scene from the TV show MASH, where the medical facility, the military facility couldn't get medical equipment, but they could get pizza by crossing out machine gun. So paperwork doesn't always make sense, and this is not just limited to agronomy. So in conclusion, the demand for more paperwork is increasing. There's more data being required, and there's a higher volumes of materials being moved around. And since people don't know how or don't want to do data entry, this leads to increased or possibly forced animation to get machines to do the paperwork for them and done correctly. So we like ontologies. We see the value because they're powerful and versatile from an information management perspective. However, from the farmer, the grain buyer, and the consumer, from their perspective, they don't care because as long as it just works. So we know the value of ontologies for research purposes, but we need to make them useful for multiple audiences. Our previous venture was sold, and now we switch gears to traceability for beer and beer ingredients. Our new ontologies are located at rdf.org, and we also have a GitHub repository from which you're more than welcome to check out as well. When we write an ontology, usually the ontology is correct. However, since no ontologies exist with the amount of varieties that we deal with, or instances, we've had to create ontologies that are operationally focused on agronomy ontologies with less focus on research because that's what's most important to the client. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
Yay! Thanks, Jessica. That was fantastic. I have lots of questions for you about a possible beer ontology. That was great. As we previously mentioned, make sure you drop all your burning questions for Jessica into the Google Doc. I look forward to having a chat about this with you later. But for the sake of time, we're going to power through with our next speaker. So thanks again, Jess. That was fantastic. All right. Next up is Kyle McKillop from the USDA Agricultural Research Service, or the ARS. Kyle is the lead on the USDA's FoodData Central, which is an integrated data system that provides expanded nutrient profile data and links to related agricultural and experimental research. He has a bachelor's in computer science and a master's in information management management with a specialty in technology development and deployment. He previously worked for the University of Maryland's Joint Institute for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, where he worked on developing food database systems, including modernizing the USDA's food composition database, which is something that we have looked at a lot for Food On. In January of this year, Kyle joined the USDA's Beltsville Human Nutrition Research Center to lead Food Data Central's data collection efforts and to manage future application developments. Kyle will be telling us all about the USDA's Food Data Central ontology integration efforts. So with that, take it away, Kyle.
Great, thank you very much. All right. All right, how do we look?
Fantastic.
Good. Great. All right. So first, I want to mention, as I go through and talk about our ontology integration, it's actually a team of people. Some names that you might recognize have presented already. So I just want to make sure that people understand it's a team of people, not only from Food On, but from USDA that are working on this ontology integration. So I want to frame the discussion first, because we're going to be talking about linking our data to ontologies. So I think you need to understand what our data are. Thank you, Emma, for mentioning what Food Data Central is. Now, what I want to highlight here is the integrated data set aspect of Food Data Central. We have multiple data sets that deal with different issues. We have data sets that have analytical component analysis. We have data sets that are foods as they're recorded in the What We Eat in America survey that links survey foods to nutrient composition. We have labeled data that's provided by the industry. And within the next month, we're launching a new data type called experimental foods, which is focusing on data collected in an experimental environment. And what I really want to highlight is foundation foods. This is our key data set and aspect that we like to highlight on Food Data Central, which is we're collecting analytical component analysis on food samples, but we're also gathering a breadth of metadata on these samples. And so our needs includes understanding and defining those terms and the metadata that we're collecting and ensuring that we're consistent with other definitions that exist out there. So that really is what originally brought us to the idea of we need an ontology. And so as we explored our needs of why we wanted an ontology system, it brought us to other things that we thought we could potentially solve with integrating ontologies. One was application usability, and I'll remind you that our primary users are researchers. So how are we going to get them to use and understand our data as efficiently as possible? That includes harmonizing multiple controlled vocabulary systems. There are multiple systems for food classification and categorization, and where you come from means you use a different system. Nutrient classification and understanding that nutrient analysis has multiple analytical methods and understanding what can be compared. Metadata definitions, as I said, for those foundation foods on what we're collecting and how they're defined. We want to increase our search understanding and capabilities. This is just an example. Foods high in essential amino acids and low in sodium per 100 gram servings. I can't say this is something that we'll actually have coming to Food Data Central, but it highlights an example of the type of searches people want to be able to do because of the type of data they might be trying to collect and understand in our system. And an ontology is going to help us understand those search terms and potentially implement those sorts of search terms depending on the data we actually have in our data system. And our key is really discovering and understanding food component differences. What makes a ripe banana different versus an overripe banana? As we know, maybe starches and sugars, but can an ontology help us define these differences, define ripe and overripe, so that we can understand these component differences? And the second aspect is research. We are the agricultural research service, and we have a lot of interest for gaining insights in our data through these ontological pathways that exist. And ultimately, our goal is to understand the impacts of agriculture on food quality, food nutrition composition, and ultimately then on the impact of human health outcomes. And so for us, then it came to, okay, well, do we build an ontology? Do we select an ontology? And we knew immediately that we didn't have the resources or time to build our own ontology. There exists a lot of ontology and controlled vocabulary systems that exist out there. So the first thing for us is what do we do? There's a lot out there. It can be a little bit of analysis paralysis and trying to determine what's appropriate for you, because usually the answer is there's no one thing that is the most appropriate for you, and is not going to cover 100% of your needs. And luckily, with our work with Food On and our collaboration with that group, learning about not only the Food On ontology, but the whole Obo Foundry family, understanding that this was the approach that we wanted to go for. There were some very positive things about this, not only the interoperability that the Obo Foundry family gives us, but different things that were attractive to us for domain-specific vocabularies, the types of metadata that we're going to be collecting on our foods. And if those ontology systems exist, how can we leverage that? But with any sort of implementation of an ontology, it's never going to fit your needs. So what do we do with the missing terms? What do we do with the differing definitions? For example, we define raw differently than FDA is going to define raw for food safety issues. And then we have data that we're collecting on food processing that doesn't necessarily exist in the vocabularies that we have right now, or doesn't exist yet. So how do we manage that? That comes to our second challenge, which is actually taking our data and mapping it to an ontology system. How do we do it? How do we reconcile some of the things that we need in those differences? And so with working with the group that I mentioned at the beginning, we have what I call kind of this ontology integration layer. On the right, I have listed Food On, but this could be any ontology or the whole list of Obo Foundry family. But I've listed Food On because we've actually done some of this work already, and we've used Food On as an example. So let's say the term exists in Food On. Well, we can take our data, which exists on the left, and I've highlighted foundation foods because this is data we've actually mapped. And if the term exists in an ontology we're using with Food On, we can link that term directly over to that Food On ontology if it is a one-to-one comparison. But for those terms that don't exist or the definitions differ, that's where the integration layer kind of comes in. Whether it be words like mature leafy greens versus baby leafy greens, fortified foods, and terms that don't necessarily exist in the ontology architecture, we need to make sure that we can map those terms so that they become database features. The other is, how do we deal with differences in definition? So potentially we have raw, but we want to highlight that there are other raw definitions out there. If someone searches for raw on our database, they need to understand it needs to be communicated what our definition of raw is versus understanding that their definition of raw might be coming from a different system. So reconciling this is through the integration layer. The other aspect of this is that the Food On and Obo Foundry family is ever evolving and expanding. And so while the terms don't exist today, they might exist in the future. And one aspect of this is making sure that we work closely with the Obo Foundry family and with Food On what sort of terms we need, and making sure that we're giving the expertise that those ontology systems need to understand how their users are using it and what sorts of terms and definitions they need. But ultimately, this integration layer allows our application to continue running while those data and ontology systems are being updated. And as terms become available, then we can take advantage of them and we can update our links in these lines to those Food On ontologies. So that's great. We do this all in Excel and in Word, which is not actual in implementation technology-wise. So that brings us to another challenge, which is technology. You can link ontologies to structured systems. Many people have done it, but to be flexible as we're moving forward into the future, it becomes more cumbersome, more resource intensive as ontologies change and as more data is coming into your system that you're mapping. So we found it key that we needed to implement a graph database and change from the structured database that we have and move towards a graph database rather than this line by line Excel document, more of a graph structure like you're seeing here. We selected Neo4j, which isn't, as we recognize, the optimal solution for ontology integration because of the way that it's designed, but it is a compromise between the integration of the ontology and the features that we need for a website that disseminates information. So it is this compromise that we made as far as implementation that we think we can have the best of both worlds as much as possible. We're only launching this on FoodData Central. We have not done any of this work internally. So our internal systems don't use the graph database. It is only going to be the external This is going to release in this next October's release, but you're not going to notice it. And that we're not advertising it. We're not putting any new features that use the graph database. This is just a tech transfer. The idea is to make sure that you understand that we're not trying to impact your use just because we've changed the technology. So in October, you shouldn't notice this, but now we have the foundation to move forward. And so what that means is we also haven't integrated the ontology just yet. And so that's what we're going to be moving forward. The image I did provide here is actually from our prototype where we did implement the ontology. So in this case, brown is the food on terms, blue is our foundation foods, and reds are their samples with the data. So you can look at this and potentially look at it and think, ooh, is there something interesting I can discover by having that ontology integration? And so that leads us, great, thank you. So ultimately that leaves us to my last slide, which is what do we have left? We're only in the middle of integrating right now. We need to make it useful. We need to actually work on moving this. And the first and the biggest thing is ontology expertise. I have a master's degree in information management, but I don't have the expertise of designing, developing, adding terms, and implementing ontologies. And it's really important that you have that expertise in your group and in your system that you work with in order to take advantage of it. Not only we want to try and bring in someone this year, we're trying really hard so that we can also start enhancing our research aspects of this, because you really need that expertise to understand how to do the research aspect and understanding that, as well as our mapping efforts. That leads us into changing our internal. So number 2, on making sure our internal system can deal with this data in term curation and mapping of terms. And then hopefully into next year, we're actually implementing the ontology into our application so people can use it and do those features, and we're using it for our research. And that's 2021 plus. We're going to continue that moving forward. And then lastly, one of our goals is to implement artificial intelligence to give us insights about our data. So 2022, I don't know, perhaps we'll find out moving forward, but learning what is the difference between overripe and ripe, or learning things we didn't know about our data, is something that we're interested in expanding as we move forward. So great, thanks.
Yay, Kyle, that was fantastic. I have a million questions here that I'm going to drop into the Google Doc in just a second, because there's a lot of things that I want to discuss with you. So everybody else, I invite you to do the same. Put all your questions for Kyle into the Google Doc. I just want to remind everybody to please make sure that your mic is muted. There's a little bit of rustling in that last in the last talk, but it was fantastic nevertheless. So thanks very much for that, Kyle. Okay, so in the interest of time, we're going to power through. Our next speaker is Leila Saldanha from the Office of Dietary Supplements at the NIH. Since 2008, Leila has been serving as a scientific subject matter expert, assisting the Dietary Supplements Label Database, known as the DSLD project at the NIH. Leila, along with the DSLD federal partners, is working on the modernization of the database, which provides information on the composition of supplements extracted from product labels. Among their goals are to ensure interoperability with the USDA's FoodData Central, which we just heard about from Kyle. And as such, her interest is in determining how to integrate food in the dietary supplements label database. Leila's talk is titled "The Inclusion of Dietary Supplements as a Subcategory of Foods in Food Ontology Systems." Now we're just going to pause the recording. Okay, great. We're back again. And just for the sake of time, we're going to power through with our 4th speaker. So next up is Amanda Windsor from the USDA. She comes from the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. Amanda is a postdoctoral fellow at the USDA with a background in using molecular data to inform and support taxonomic decisions in describing crustacean data, and she has experience in building reference libraries for crustacean seafood identification at FDA. Recently, she shifted her research to exploring metagenomic methods for characterization of food microbiomes. Late last year, she was invited to join a group of FDA scientists and collaborators that aim to build a mixed minimum information about any sequence compliant food metadata standard. Although she didn't know what an ontology was at the time, she found that her previous life in metadata-heavy museum-based research had prepared her for a meaningful contribution to the development of the food metadata standard. and that's what she'll be presenting today. So the title of Amanda's talk is the FDA Development of a Mix or Minimum Information About Any Sequence Food Environmental Metadata Standard. So thanks very much, Amanda, and the floor is yours.
All right, can you see my screen?
Yep, we sure can.
Okay.
It's kind of small though.
Okay, I have no idea how to fix that. Hold on.
The speaker notes section's really big. I think if you get rid of that.
Oh, okay. Hold on, because so it is doing something weird then. Hold on, let me stop sharing for a second.
Sure.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect. Absolutely
Okay.
perfect.
Perfect. Okay. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about how we at FDA, along with collaborators with like FoodOn and in the industry and academia, have tried to develop a mix or minimum information about X sequence and environmental package for foods. So the idea to actively pursue the development of a food metadata package stemmed from this recent study on a project of environmental swabs from metagenomic sequencing of environmental swabs from frozen seafood products and other studies. We wanted the data that we uploaded to be NCBI and mix compliant, but it became clear that no single available package captured all of the pertinent information. So you can see we have all of this, not collected information. So we wanted something that would capture that. Also at FDA, we're interested in understanding the pathogen burden at each stage of the farm to fork continuum, because there are opportunities for pathogen introduction into the food supply across all stages of the supply chain. A metadata standard that aims to capture information about samples at each stage of the process is very important for interoperability of data within the FDA and for all of our sampling efforts, but also across the food research landscape. It's also important, if you're sampling one year, you find a violation, you want to go back and sample the next year. And if you can compare those two data sets, you can actually gain a lot of information about the facility that we're testing. So to get started, after we identified the need for the food package, how are we going to build this? We started with a small group within the FDA Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition and the Center for Veterinary Medicine. Then we brought in the group to about 40 members from the US, Canada, and Europe, representing academia, government agencies, and industry. An important task was to define the scope of these packages, and we did this by looking at use cases presented by members of the larger group and from literature. So we wanted to know what metadata was already being collected. I have to say the mix agriculture package that was, it's still in development, but it was proposed and published by Dwyer and Arias in early 2020, was incredibly helpful for us in helping us understand how to start structuring and get over as Kyle said, the analysis paralysis. Additionally, we looked at what terms we could reuse from existing mixed environmental packages. And finally, we wanted to incorporate the ontologies into this standard. So we set about matching existing ontology terms to the types of metadata we wanted to collect. So we went through FoodOn, GenEpio, Envo, OBI, NCT, Agro, among others, pouring through all of those to find existing ontology terms that fit what we needed. So broadly, the scope of this package covers metagenomic sequences associated with food or food production. But when you stop to think about what includes food and its production, processing, and distribution, the idea of developing a useful metadata standard seems quite daunting. We just didn't know where to begin. We decided the only way to manage this was a divide and conquer approach, in which we divided the types of samples we are concerned with into 4 main categories: food for human consumption, the food production environment, the farm production environment, and livestock and animal feed. From here, we designated team leaders for each category and formed subgroups to semi-independently develop a standard that worked for each of those categories. Here's an example of a use case that got us started. It's from a food production facility, and the information recorded includes sampling location, in this case, the food production facility, the type of food that's produced there, the information about the sampling devices, and where in the facility the sample was collected, how the sample was transported, and finally how it was processed. All of this put information, plus a lot that couldn't fit onto this slide, is important to understanding the sample and for comparing to future sample events, either in the same location or similar facilities. Again, the interoperability of data is really important. There we go. To continue the divide and conquer theme, we started breaking the use cases into the basic steps of the sampling process. The location where the sample is taken, the sample itself, the collection procedure, transportation, and wet lab procedures. Basically, what metadata do we need to collect for the whole life cycle of the sample from collecting to sequencing? In addition to the 5 metadata categories we just talked about, we considered metadata which is required by MICS for all the environmental minimum information about a metagenome sequence, or the MIMS, and that which is required by the NCBI and captured in the biosample and the bioproject submission process. And again, we tried to tie as many of these metadata terms to existing ontological terms as possible. The past few months, we've been working on this, and we've started to refine the terms, and we've started consolidating redundant terms, deciding the granularity for which we want to use. And as Emma knows, this is an ongoing facet of our refinement process. Emma has actually seen our first draft of this. We've looked at more use cases as we're going through this, and we've developed a list of terms that we're calling a curated terms that are shared across all 4 of our sub-packages. And the curated sheet lets us make sure that our definitions are consistent across the packages. And of course, we also need to get everything into MixS format, which we are also in the process of doing right now. So kind of wrapping up our progress. At this point, we've submitted our first draft to the Genome Standard Consortium, who does MICS. We've received really positive feedback about this first draft. We're starting to move into the second draft, working on incorporating all of their suggestions. We're aiming to have this package ready for the release of the next MICS standard, which is going to be version 6, maybe next year. But also, our job doesn't end with the publication of the standard. We plan to create guidance documents that help the user when, maybe they're starting a new project and they have no idea what metadata they need to collect. We're going to give them some guidance. What's the scope of each package? How are they going to use this to incorporate these metadata into their everyday data collection process? We also have some targeted areas of development, particularly within the animal feed subcat package. And we're also working with food curators like Emma and Damion to create new terms that are related to our data standard that maybe we, a definition just doesn't quite fit what we need. So we're going to go ahead and try to make a new term and get those up and help build the food on ontology. And so I need to give a real special thanks to everybody who's been involved with this, especially the other sub-package developers. Jennifer Jones and Chris Grimm have really gotten the animal feed sub-package into really good shape. Susan Leonard and Taylor Richter have done a phenomenal job with the farm environment. Brendan Kurasek has done all of the heavy lifting with the food processing. I've done the human foods. Our evaluation and refinement are by Maria Balki and Padmini Ramachandran from FDA, Lynn from the GSC, and Damion and Emma. We really just couldn't have done this without their help too. And with that, I am all done.
Wonderful. Thanks, Amanda. That was a fantastic overview of the mix food package effort. I just want to say that I have seen the first draft, and I want to congratulate everybody involved because you've done a really fabulous job with all 4 packages. It's really ambitious. It's a really tough job. And like I said, you've done a great job. And these standards are really critical because, you know, the public data can be a little bit of a wild west. So I think that this is going to be a big step forward for helping to wrangle that. So thanks for sharing your presentation today. Lots of questions for you later, but we're going to move on with our 5th and final presentation of the day. Last but not least, our final speaker is a collaborator, a colleague, and a friend of mine. Her name is Fernanda Doria, and she is a veterinary epidemiologist working at the Swedish National Veterinary Institute. Her research is focused on One Health disease surveillance. She's very interested in ontologies as tools for interoperability across health sectors involved in surveillance, and as tools for the creation of automated workflows to extract value from existing data, delivering actionable information to decision makers, which is really important. So today, Nanda will be talking to us about the health surveillance ontology, supporting semantic interoperability in One Health. So with that, Nanda, the mic is yours.
Thank you, Emma. The program was put together really well. I was worried how I was going to follow up all that crop talk. But then Amanda came in, and it's now your mindset is starting to think already about the pleasant things I've introduced, such as foodborne outbreaks of diseases. And that's where I come in on the food word. So as Emma said, we're working with the health surveillance, and I'm a veterinary epidemiologist. So my job has been animal health for a long time. But now we're trying to extend the work we do in surveillance to One Health. And this picture is kind of the sectors that are involved in the kind of data we are dealing with. So you have the animals becoming food and then feeding people. And when we think about transmission of diseases, we think about that direction, that maybe some foodborne zoonoses will pass from animals to people through this direction, but the work we do is going on the other direction. So we are not modeling the transmission. We are worrying about the data about these outbreaks that we are investigating and other types of surveillance that we do. But I will be using as an example here, people getting sick, going to the doctor, we register those cases, we detect outbreaks, and we may do an outbreak investigation. So in the process of trying to give context to this outbreak, and as Jessica said on the beginning, we deal a lot with kinds of things that the context is only on people's heads. I loved that quote. So we can't compare the activities among countries or among sectors because people register the data, but not the context about those data. And of course, there is a lot of levels of information to deal with, but there is already a lot of ontologies focusing on those different things. So as Amanda said, they are focusing on the samples that are collected. There are ontologies to do with cases, even isolates. And what we're worried about is the context of how those samples came to be. What were the triggers for collecting information about for instance, a food vehicle as part of an outbreak. There is also regular surveillance, just surveys of food at retailers, for instance, to ensure that they don't have a certain level. So there's a lot of activities that are done regularly or triggered by specific things like an outbreak. And the context, when you see a number, when you say that a survey collected 50 samples, the context of that. So the typical data set would be a data set about results. So you would have the number of samples collected, the number that were positive, the number of people sick. But what the health surveillance ontology is trying to model is the information about the methods that generated those data. So what was the objective in animal health, food safety, or public health? And we are modeling the process of surveillance following OBIS, the Ontology of Biomedical Investigations. So we have, instead of a study design, we have a surveillance protocol. And that surveillance protocol has 4 action points. So 4 action plans: the diagnostic, the sampling collecting, the designing of the sampling, and then the actual collection of sample. Could be the reporting protocol in case of clinical cases, and then the diagnostic protocol. So this part about the context of the information you get is what we're worried about. And the central concept for us is the surveillance activity here. I will come up. This is, of course, I don't intend to go through this fight of indigenous here with arrows to every side, but this is my Damion Dooley diagram type, inspired by Damion's. This is the current version of the ontology, and I will dive a bit more into this. But the idea here to show these green boxes are the results that are usually reported. And what we're trying to do is capture all this context that usually would not be put down when you communicate the results. So we have surveillance reports year after year that say we had 3,000 cases of Campylobacter in Sweden in 2019, and there's nothing that tells you how those were sampled. Why do we have so many more cases than Italy? Is it because we have more disease or because we have better surveillance, for instance? So the context about how those results came to be, all of this, that we want to associate all of this information on the screen to the little green boxes of one number that gets reported. And when we started, we were looking at the One Health picture as, you know, gathering all these sources of data, and we really thought we would focus on the interoperability between these data sets, kind of thinking those data sets are going to be put together for some use. But so we focused on linked data. But what we discovered is that we first need to make those data linkable. People need first to know that those data exist. And we realized that in this chain from farm to fork, there is surveillance being carried out at different steps. And we were worried about the data in each of those steps, but the sectors don't know about each other's activities, and they don't know about what each other is doing. So it is about identifying the context, but also making each sector aware of how to interpret that context, what are the similarities, what are the differences, and being able to document when things change. Because if, you know, the context is only on people's head, you can look through a trend of 10 years of cases and not understand what are the changes in context that were responsible for those numbers. So we started thinking about attaching context to data sets. So when you look at all of the concepts we have that allow you to tag a surveillance activity, we started thinking about what are the concepts that may be most important to attach to the data set itself. So imagine you have a data set in Excel that nobody is ever going to have maybe the ambition of making that data really usable or put it in a format that could be reusable, but you can at least tag that data set by saying, this is a data set of surveillance against Campylobacter done at a slaughterhouse collecting cecum from chickens. And if you have some repository of the data sets that are available, tagged by those characteristics, people can at least know that that surveillance exists. And even if then they have to retrieve the data and open an Excel, or in our case, sometimes it's a PDF. So it's only a human who can read that data. We're never going to be able to ontologize those data. We can at least lift some of the data inside the data set and put on the metadata of that data set so that it's findable. And I have here another view of the ontology, a bit upper level, where I was just compare. This is, as I said, based on OB. So we have the surveillance activity here, and the surveillance protocol would be our plan specification, which then has an objective and an action. And the reason I highlight those things is because we are modeling surveillance activities without being prescriptive on the types of surveillance activities. So we don't say this was an outbreak investigation or this was a regular monitoring. We say this was a surveillance activity, and we're reviewing a lot of data from people who do surveillance to come up with the dimensions that make those surveillance activities different. So what a surveillance, the surveillance context can be a continuous monitoring, a sporadic survey, or an outbreak investigation. And if you want to select or filter surveillance activities based on the context, that is on the hands of the data user. So what we are going to do next is, here we're still working on the ontology with the surveillance activity being our main, our central concept. But based on this understanding now that a lot of people are not going to be willing to share the data or put their data in formats that are machine interpretable, we're not going to be able to tag with the ontology their data inside, let's say, the content of their data set, but we may be able to use the ontology to give tags to the metadata of their data set. So the next step is we're going to add to the ontology the concept of a data set that already exists in other ontologies, in the IAO, I don't remember what it stands for. And the idea is that, sure, some data sets, we're going to be able to make that data set fair, and we're going to be able to model the content of the data set using the ontology. But in other cases, the data itself, it's going to continue to be a black box. But if we tag with the ontology the metadata for those data sets, if we just have a quick repository of metadata saying, this data set exists, you can find it at this location, this is the agency who holds it, but here's the type of activity that generated that data set, then we can at least have an overview of the food chain, where surveillance exists, what type of surveillance is being done, so that people can at least know what activities relate to a foodborne outbreak, for instance, and contact each other. So that's the focus we are doing right now. And we have collaborators that are setting up workflows so that our target audience can work in Excel, because that's what most of the people doing surveillance in practice are going to know. So they can give us the information for the metadata all in Excel, and we're creating automated workflows to annotate with the ontology, put it into a central repository, and then if people go into that central repository and make a search for the data they want, they can then extract the results back in Excel. We found out that creating kind of user-friendly workflows for people who have no idea what this is about is the main thing, as Kyle also talked about. So this is what I had to say. All the information about our ontology and the workflows we're using, developing to using it in practice, which is pretty much our priority, are available at datadrivensurveillance.org/ontology. Thank you.
Hooray! Great job, Nanda. Thanks for that. I really like a number of the points that you brought up, especially making data sets, understanding. Okay, let me back up a little bit. Your efforts to make data sets comparable, and the need for us to be able to just understand how comparable data sets are for doing things like risk assessments. A lot of times, as you were mentioning, a lot of the details are buried in the methods, which are in a PDF or something like that, which makes it very hard for our machines and also for humans to understand exactly how comparable. Did you collect something from chicken cecum? Was it a swab of a carcass at an abattoir? Was it a rinse of a chicken breast in some retail environment? How comparable are the counts of the bacteria from those different environments? So I think you're doing really important work. But we need to take a break before we start to dive into a number of these issues.
Mm-hmm.
So
I'm going to say one thing.
You're gonna do a plug first. So.
Yeah. All right. So the plug is that Tarini, Naravane, and Ekta, who have done the sensory taste experience workshop, need a few more volunteers to do the cooking of the most famous recipe, the banana loaf, which I could demonstrate here. Looks absolutely scrumptious when you complete it, and is excellent, most excellent for families to also test, family members to also test the experience. And I would do it in front of you right now, but I know that would bias the results. But just to say, the the question is an exciting one about whether it's store-bought versus homemade banana loaf is good. So I don't know, Tarini, if you want to say just for a minute what it is you're organizing to continue the data sampling. If you have, screen share, great.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks to everyone that participated. And as Damion said, other participants have also, an overwhelming majority, preferred the home baked. There's another weekend, the one coming up. So we're extending the workshop to get more data for analysis. We've noticed from the responses we got that there were many questions on substitutions, and we will send a detailed email for anyone else that would like to participate. We're also suggesting an alternate to the gluten-free banana bread for a few reasons. This is a lemon poppy seed cake. It uses normal flour for those who are not gluten intolerant and have a preference for that. Also, banana bread isn't popular. We were disappointed to find out, but it isn't as popular everywhere and not easy to buy for comparison. So we will send the recipe for the lemon poppy seed cake later today, so you can do your shopping before the weekend. For the response analysis, we will analyze by recipes, so the two different recipes will not affect that. And also our
Tarini, are you frozen? I think you're frozen. So just for the folks on the line that are maybe hadn't heard about this experiment before, Tarini is collecting information about, I guess, your experiences with food, looking at how people enjoy store-bought food versus food they make themselves. So they have this really awesome baking exercise. And I don't know, Dames, do we have the like a Google Doc or something, the instructions?
Yeah. We'll have Tarini send out an email to the whole participant IFO registrant group today to add those extra details.
Great. Okay, so yeah, those details will be forthcoming, and you can participate in this awesome baking experiment. It's for science, so do give it a try. But we are running a little bit over time. We need to take a break, so we're going to take about 13-minute break, I think, just so it'll be
10 minutes.
Well,
10 minutes. Yeah. Oh, I see. Okay.
So it's not like 7:22 that we come back. So we'll say we come back at 7:25. So go and get a coffee, take a bio break, take a walk around, and meet us back here at 7:25 Pacific. So in about 12 minutes, and we will dive into the integrated discussion and question period. Don't forget to put all your questions in the Google Doc that's in the chat as well. Okay, so we'll meet back here very shortly. Thank you to all our speakers, and we will chat again soon. this? I really want to thank the speakers for their great talks this morning. But I also want to thank Damion for putting the flow together the way you did, because I think we had a really nice continuum of talks. We started out talking about, agriculture and growing raw materials, and then we moved on to how to capture information and structure information about those materials and nutrients within those materials, and then how to capture that information on labels of products, which involves different kind of regulatory and scientific considerations, and then how to describe the microbial environments of those different foods. And then, as we sort of move up and up in the hierarchy, then we move on to how those microbial systems and those food components interact for surveillance and food safety. So I think that was a really nice flow this morning. We have a lot of questions in the Google Doc. So let's get to the discussion.
I'll just squeeze in one little thing, Emma.
Yeah.
Tarini mentions she's actually going to have a bake-off, a virtual online bake-off on a session on Saturday and on Sunday. And more information about that will be in the email that she sends out. So that's a great way to see the chefs in action and to get pointers on making the loaf.
Right. Great.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks.
Great. Perfect. So, right to the Google Doc. So a number of different folks have entered questions, which is fantastic. I'm going to start things off, but the way I think this is probably going to work best is if those who entered the questions into the Google Doc actually ask their questions to the speakers. And I'll sort of call your names to facilitate that. So the first question, I'm just going to be a total hog here of the microphone. But the first question I have is for Jessica, and I'm really intrigued. Why do they call it peaches and cream corn?
So that's the consumer name brand. Apparently it's because this type of corn looks like or has the same coloring as peaches and cream, but otherwise it has nothing to do with the corn itself.
Oh, okay. All right. I thought it might have been a little bit more scandalous, but that's, but no. Okay, so I don't want to there's questions for me. So another question I have is, how do you encourage the use or the compliance with standardized terminologies in agriculture? I mean, you sort of have the layman's terms, and then you have the scientific terms, and then you have all of these, like you were talking about the tractor examples. At Myra Analytics, for example, how do you encourage compliance with standards?
I'm going to let Rob actually answer that question. He can do a better job.
Great.
Okay. The answer is we're very lucky. And
Great.
What I mean by that is we control the ontology, but we also create applications that use the ontology.
Right.
So we're able to funnel data entry into our own tools, have drop downs and autocompletes. And that's how we encourage or demand that people use that terminology directly.
Right.
In reality, and Jessica hinted at this with a lot of her presentation, it's very difficult to get people to conform to a certain terminology because there's such a variety in trade names. And if you're dealing with farmers and crop production, you're dealing from anyone from a grade 6 education all the way to us. And across that, there's a very wide variety. And that's why ontologies are great for us, because we can say, okay, if you mean this, you also mean that. And there's a translation layer on top of that. Sorry,
go ahead.
The one thing I'd like to mention is that we have the reverse problem of Fernanda and Amanda, in that we can generate structured data hand over fist, but it's very difficult for us to communicate that to the end user because it's very complex and they have a very specific view of the world. So a lot of our recorded data, especially the testing data, we record with a very simple SSN structure and then link to PDFs. because most of the tests, at least in the wheat and the hops industry, are either mandated by law or they're already recorded in academia. And that's why citations are very important to us, because if there's an argument, we can always point to the actual crop definition according to the AAFC and say, this is what it is because God decreed it this way. And that terminates the argument very quickly, because it's rooted in law and it's rooted in legislation and plant breeders' rights. Right. So from our perspective, the PDF is what is awesome, because we can say, here's the law, dump, put it on the desk and say problem fixed.
And it does resolve the issue. People don't say, well, I don't care what this says, this is the way I've always done it. There
is still a lot of that. But it's funny how the acceptance of that is directly proportional to how quickly they will get paid.
Right. Money talks.
Exactly.
We have the same issue in public health risk assessments. Everybody wants to use the data in a particular way. Like you say, everyone has their own worldviews, and how to enable that from, this sort of set of data, this common set of data. How do we enable everyone's worldviews? I think that's one of the powers of ontologies, right? You can query it in certain ways. So thanks for bringing, thanks for that. When you were mentioning, you have drop down menus and you can sort of force compliance that way. Do you find that people use the system correctly? Like when do they pick the right terms? Yeah, I ask because in public health, people find very creative ways of entering their data, no matter how you try to enforce rules and structure. So
yes, and so an ugly truth is we deliberately tried to remove any mention of comment fields or description fields anywhere.
Yeah,
because that was the number one way that people would try and work around the system. At the end of the day, they had to, well, legally from a shipping perspective, they had to say it's either A or B. And we were able to put our foot down from that way. But anything that was a measurement was usually eyeballed. And the variation in the amount of grain that you had was so huge that we had no choice but to let people do what they wanted.
Right.
So we specified units, let them enter. And in many cases, we weren't checking the sanity of their results because it proved impossible.
And I think you bring up a good point. There's this sort of element of, can the data structure affect upstream practice? And sometimes it can, but then sometimes it can't. And so the data structure just has to reflect, what's happening on the ground, as imprecise as that may be sometimes. James, I think you had a question for Jessica. I'm going to let you ask that.
No, it was all. Oh.
I think it's what are your preferences for reuse of ontologies in the sector, plant ontology?
Yeah. This whole forum is all about bringing in awareness about the different ontologies and camps. So, Warren, you mentioned SSN. Could say a word about some of the existing ontologies out there that are useful and that exist outside of the Obo Foundry that I'm familiar with.
Jessica, do you mind if I steal your thunder?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I'm aware of a number of ontologies and a number of ontology repositories. Whenever possible, we try to reuse terms. I'm going to get in my soapbox here for about 5 minutes. My major issue with ontologies as they are created today is our lack of documentation. And by documentation, I don't necessarily mean the 500-page document about it or the scientific publication that says, look at my ontology. I mean simple things like labelings, descriptions, multilingual labels, and just basically a 2-paragraph item that says, here's the theory of operations of this ontology. This is how it fixes problems. And I know this sounds a little bit bizarre to you, but again, the Wizard of Oz, the people that use the ontology don't look at the ontology, they look at the labels because that's what's on the screen in front of them. And if your label is poor or only in English or doesn't have language tags, it's very hard for us to use that within another application because we don't have anything to show to the end user to use it with. So for example, from a geographic perspective, one thing we always use is geonames. It has its own notion, it has multilingual labels in 26 languages. It covers most of the globe. And it allows me to determine that Toronto is in Canada, which fixes most of my problems from a shipping perspective. And so the other thing that I just want to just nudge at OBO, we used a lot of OBO for units. As Jessica mentions, for bizarre units like bushels, it's a volume measurement, but it changes by crop. So now you say, well, it's not really the units, it's the unit with the crop, and that becomes very messy ontologically. So it's all the corner cases and the details that really make reuse difficult. And if we can get a bit more documentation, I think it'll help us move data back and forth, because at least we know the points where we agree and where we disagree.
And I think you've hit a lot of nails on the head there. You know, so while the OBO Foundry has made huge strides in, you know, coming up with principles and practices for creating ontologies, there's still I just had a lecture the other day and students were asking me, you know, how do you know when you need to update your standard? Or, you know, there's no standards around standards. So I think that I'm kind of jotting down, making a list of things that, you know, that would be something that might go into a standard about standards or standards for ontologies. So I think everything you said is very well taken about the documentation. You know, we also see things, just talking about geographical locations. People often ask us for groupings of geographical locations, like they want to group states together or group provinces together, because for privacy reasons, you might only have one abattoir in one province, right? So if you say that the sample was from an abattoir and it was in, you know, X province, people are going to know where that was right away. And so, you know, they want to group things together, but the sort of groupings, geographical groupings for that people use for the Beef Ranchers Association is different than the health authority classifications, groupings of states and provinces. So being able to capture those and make those interchangeable, I think is important too.
If I can give you a partial solution to that.
Yeah, please do.
There's a little known standard called GeoSparkle put out by OGC, which has a convenient differentiation between the geometry and the feature. And so it allows you to do bizarre things such as create a new area and say these 3 states are part of that area without committing to an actual geometry. And that fixes a lot of problems where we know, you know, it's an abattoir, we know that it's in Dakota, we don't know where. And
right.
that has been very useful.
Awesome. Great. Okay, let me just go back to the doc here. Okay, so in the light of time, I'm going to move on to, I'm going to let Jessica and Warren off the hot seat for now, but hopefully we will get some more integrated questions later on. So quick question for Kyle. When you're talking about experimental foods, do you expect that the metadata facets for experimental foods are going to be the same as sort of natural foods, or do you expect there to be different kinds of attributes that we would need to take into consideration?
Yeah, I'm going to answer this first by saying that our focus isn't on experimental foods and the ontology on those to start, because we have all of these other data sets that exist that we want people to search for to find nutrient composition. And experimental foods, by their nature, are not going to be data that should necessarily be used as reference.
Okay.
So making sure the person coming in understands that there is a difference between experimental foods and the other data in our system. is challenges and things that we have to overcome first. But ultimately, as we move forward with experimental foods and we start linking data, I think metadata facets for things like experimental foods, we might be seeing, depending on their use and depending on how often we get new research in, for things like the experimental conditions, things that specifically get at them being experimental foods and helping us define the difference between experimental foods and foundation. That because they're grown in a unique environment, whereas foundation foods are things that should be consumed by an American population. So what is the distinction when you have an experiment, but those foods are still something that can potentially be consumed? So we have some things that we still have to work out on our end for those definitions. So I think the answer is yes, and I think it gets into the next question I'm seeing on here as well, when it talks about other claims. So if I might just go ahead and I'll go into that one.
Do you want to just quickly state the question? Yeah.
Yeah. Your question was how do we deal with things like food claims, low sodium, and thresholds, and defining those. And again, it gets at our primary goals being on our metadata and distinguishing and defining those. And things like low sodium are things we're not worried about right now, because our branded data doesn't capture label claims and things like that. We don't have that data in the system. We're focused on nutrient composition and component composition of food. So we're focused on the terms and terminology that might get at the variability for those. But the reality is we have people who come into our database and want low sodium. And so we answer that not through an ontology and defining that term. We answer that by letting them take sodium and sort from in ascending order. So they see foods with lower sodium first. And that's kind of the way that we're handling it right now. As we approach with both experimental foods and other things like this, I think are things we're not focused on right now, but in the future, when we get at these aspects, then, I mean, I'm looking at some of the presenters today as far as all of these other domains that we need to get into and how we handle those, how we pull those in, how we define those. So it's a challenge we're quite honestly not going to be taking on.
Right. So a question I had for, well, you and Leila actually. So how do well, I don't know actually if this kind of with your food data central, I don't know if this comes into play, but in some of the food classification schemes that we've seen before, there's definite differences in the way people define food. So for example, how the USDA versus the FDA would define game differs because of prior sort of legal jurisdictional kind of things. Right? USDA is responsible for looking at these types of foods or these types of animals. FDA is responsible for these other things, and then how they define them are different. So I just wonder if in looking at Food Data Central, do you see any of these sorts of regulatory jurisdictional things coming into play for how you define food elements, food nutritional things?
I mean, it's our things that have already come up, right? Because when we determine, I used raw as an example, and when you deal with FDA and food safety, raw has a very specific meaning. And for us, it's not necessarily the same meaning. If we look at it from things that are unprocessed, then potentially flour wouldn't be in a raw state, whereas it would be considered raw for food safety. So context is important when we talk about defining these things. And for us, we really need to start with what is our context. You can talk all day about tomatoes and watermelons, and are they fruits or are they vegetables, right? They can fit in different categories, and the context that you come in, it makes all of the difference on how that term is defined. The best we can do is understand that those differences exist and be able to communicate those, which is why we have that kind of integration layer in there, is to deal with those and understanding that our definition doesn't necessarily match with the other definitions that exist. That's not to say that we don't try and be consistent, right? At the end of the day, the more consistent we are, the easier it is on the user and the people using our data So if we have references and we can link to other definitions, then we will.
Great.
Just wanted to add to what Kyle just said.
Mm-hmm.
So in our dietary supplement label database, we capture all the information that's printed on the label.
Right.
And when it comes to claims, what we have done is we created Longwall codes for claim categories.
Mm-hmm.
But there is a search box. If you wanted to search for specifically sodium claims, you could search for sodium claims. The other point I wanted to make was our database is derived from label information, and the FDA has primary authority about what can be on that label. Of course, with foods, depending on the type of food, like some of the meat and dairy, I'm not, the USDA has jurisdiction over the labeling. But the FDA does give companies a lot of flexibility on how they can list what we call the non-daily value nutrients. For the daily value nutrients, for example, now it has to be listed as folate and not folic acid. So there is a standardization of the terminology that can be used, but that's not the case when it comes to the non-daily value nutrients. And that flexibility lies with the companies and not with the agency.
Okay. So many layers of complexity.
Yes.
So Kyle, just getting back to your Neo4j graph database. So first of all, I think this is a fantastic way to move from spreadsheet. So, but the next step is what do you anticipate the data entry load to be like to get this off the ground?
Right. So some of it is a lot of right now just kind of manual mapping and using the Food On group to help with that and determining it, bringing in that expert. But we've designed or redesigned the system in mind that to allow pathways for new metadata types, so that as we introduce new terms and new facets, the application is just ready to take them. We don't have to go to a contractor and have that contractor redefine those database terms, add those queries, and then add those to the display, which can be very resource intensive. So using a graph database lets you just put in pathways, and we've designed the application so that those pathways can just exist in the application once they're introduced. And we have somewhat of that mimicking structure in our SQL database right now, but it's very cumbersome. It's very difficult to deal with, and it's very difficult to get people to understand because they're all grouped together, these set of definitions, and they're not as well defined as our actual columns in our database. So that's one aspect of it, but we really do, we're working on our data pipeline. It's a continual process of how do we map these terms, and that's things we're going to be continuing moving forward, especially bringing in an expert to help with that effort.
Right, great. And I think there was another question for you about the graph database, but that we don't have the name attached. Right? So, so I will ask you the question. So for those considering Neo4j, where, if at all, does Neo4j fall short of OWL-RDF in expressivity in terms of ability to query reason over ontological contents, link outside terms, etc.? How do you deal with this?
Right. So this is obviously someone who has also looked at Neo4j for sure. And feel free to reach out to me with other comments or thoughts about this, because we've struggled with the same thing. Neo4j isn't built around being able to import things like OWL-RDF ontologies, unlike some other graph database technologies are. And so we had to be able to balance the ability to bring things in with the fact that we're disseminating a mass amount of data and other features that we might want to be able to use for graph database that don't necessarily go through the ontology pathways. Because at the end of the day, we need to make sure that the hundreds of thousands of queries we get to our API in a day are pulling back the data as people are used to getting it. So that's why we developed the prototype. So the prototype idea was, can we import an RDF ontology into Neo4j and at least be able to access it and traverse through it. And it was just a proof of concept, which the proof of concept was true. Now, the way we implemented it was not a way that we actually want to use it on Food Data Central, but you could search for bean and it would say, using the food on ontology, be able to separate out and say, okay, so are you looking for these types of beans? Because these types of beans have data in our database. So it highlights specifically the pathway between the term that you searched for and the data that existed in our database. So we showed a proof of being able to query along those pathways. I think we're hopeful that those longer queries and those longer pathways, which can be more cumbersome when you go from the left side of the graph to the right side with lots of nodes in between. We're not sure, but those sorts of research and efforts are actually going to happen in a public. So when we talk about doing ontology research, we're talking about potentially putting Neo4j and others in a more controlled environment to have more resources to specifically focus on running through those pathways rather than the user experience of pulling data back.
Great.
And Damion, maybe you can speak to it a few bit more, because Damion went back and forth with our team when selecting it on a technology, and was definitely a champion for trying to find something that was RDF friendly, but managing that.
Yeah. So I guess I would say two things are involved. One is if you view ontologies as a source of descriptive facets for, and you've broken those down into little graphs or little lists of terms, then that's usually what everybody is turning to ontology for to annotate their metadata with. They're not looking to ontologies to provide a model data structure. And so I think the wonderful thing about the whole ontology platform is that it is providing a multilingual, open source, readily standardizable platform for vocabulary for those pick lists, for those little branches of hierarchy of term, whether it's taxonomy or food production methods, processes, or whatever. So it's very easy to take that attitude, those little branches, and pop them into Neo4j and then reference them from the data structures that you've modeled. So the challenge, so that's a great use case right there. You can fly in quickly and do that. The much more elaborate challenge is to actually take a look at these property graph databases like Neo4j and try to map over the data structures that you've defined. You've just started using ontologies, not just for the terms for the ISA subclass, superclass, but now you've started trying to model relations between the branches. And that's where Neo4j doesn't just take that model in and let you run with it. The ontology has to sit as sort of a second graph inside Neo4j alongside your data structure always. You can make, so I'll just to wrap that up, the choice of data structure. So in the case of FDC, creating a model that starts with a biosample taken from the field or a store, and then associating that with all of its measurables, analytic methods, and the outcoming data, and then moving up a level and saying, let's collect these into little sample bundles because they represent the same kind of food, and offer that out to users, which is the next move that's coming up for FDC. Versus an older model, which was in the SQL databases of canning that. Well, ontologies could come by with their own pure model of what a biosample is and all the facets of description. So actually at the lower level, it's pretty easy to see and use the relationships there. But yeah, Neo4j is one step removed, no reasoning whatsoever that you get in the OWL world. So that's my last point.
Thanks, Damion.
The OWL platform is wonderful for straightening out all the weird stuff, the broken stuff in your vocabulary, and enabling it to be a sort of a gold standard vocabulary to then go and use on databases and know that you aren't mixing up terms and semantics as you deliver them to the database for use.
Great. I think Matthew in the chat was clarifying it was other logical but not hierarchical axiomatic relationships that he was talking about.
Yeah, that's exactly what Damion just referred to. So sorry, I didn't put my name on that question. I stepped away for just a second, but that was the heart of my question for Kyle was how, how do you represent that in Neo4j, and is that important in the mission? And it doesn't seem as though at this stage that it is. So it doesn't really matter.
Great. And you were also wondering if users can download the database, right?
Yeah, is that in the plan?
Not in the October release plan, but in the future we'll review it, and people can reach out to me as well if there's something that they would like to look at. But putting a download out also means communicating exactly what people are looking at, and that wasn't our focus for the October release. The focus is that people don't notice a difference. So feel free to reach out to me.
Awesome. Great. Okay, so for the interest of time, we're going to keep powering through this doc that has lots and lots of questions. So thanks, Kyle, for answering all those questions. Rob, you entered a question for Leila in the doc. Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. So Leila, you were talking about formal nomenclature and Latin nomenclature for elements. I found it very interesting that you were having good alignment luck with all of the varieties that you're looking for, because in hops and in wheat, it is totally the other way around, and that nobody seems to be updating these nomenclatures, and all of the varietal nomenclature seems to be focused on plants' breeders' rights. So essentially it stops at Durham, and everything below is new and not, and there is no Latin or structured nomenclature. So do you think that's a byproduct of stagnation and new cinnamon varieties?
So I'm not an expert in this area, but a couple years ago, I wrote a paper on that included cinnamon in the discussion. And the American Herbal Products Association puts out some literature and books which are included in the US regulation. And it was my understanding that they were working with botanical centers like, the Missouri Botanical Gardens, and I forget the name of the center in New York, the big botanical center, to create some harmony and synergy between all this nomenclature. So I'm assuming that it would include wheat. How far they're drilling down, I don't know, but I would suggest either contacting the Missouri Botanical Garden, and the name of the center in New York is escaping me, but apparently there's another very huge botanical garden in New York that they're also working with. So I would suggest, or even contacting the American Herbal Products Association, Dr. Michael McGuffin, because he's working with them on, obviously, there's not a lot of wheat in dietary supplement products, but I'm sure that, this is part of the bigger and larger effort that they're working on.
Thank you.
And James, I think you had a question for Leila too.
I noticed there are lots of questions for me.
Yeah, lots of questions for you.
Yeah, so Leila, your presentation really touched on existing vocabularies, and then this new Unicode system that your agency is really turning to for supporting your vocabulary, controlled vocabulary. So I'm wondering, as Food On, if we, to take synonym as an example, if we look up the Unicode for cinnamon, are we getting that variety of cinnamon varieties that you mentioned are important to distinguish in your talk? I just checked cinnamon in my own in Foodon, and I think we've got the Languel. We've inherited the Languel varieties of cinnamon as a plant organism. So we've got, I think, 6 of the 7 that you mentioned. But we would want to carry out a mapping exercise to see if Unicode, if we could match each of those to the Unicode thing, for example.
So when you go in, there is, I think, 42 synonyms for synonym. We haven't really started working with FDA. Our plan is to work with FDA. We're in the process of modernizing our database, and to do this automatic mapping, we need our files to be in the JSON format. And there are lots of questions that we do have for the FDA team that's within the Office of the Commissioner. So I think all these questions will probably come up as we do the mapping and we run into glitches. Remember that the big difference between dietary supplement labels and drug labels is that the drug companies have to enter the information. So the drug companies have to choose the code. And we obviously are guessing because we have the label and then we're trying to map it to the Unicode. So there's going to be a little bit of a challenge there.
Okay.
I also wanted to get briefly to Emma's question about standardization of labels across countries, because I think this falls within that same kind of territory. So there are 2 issues with labels. One is format and one is content. So the format of labels are very different from country to country. Obviously, Canada has dual labeling. We don't have any dual labeling because we don't have French also and English as our national languages. So the format is very different from country to country, but the content is, I would say you would find that information. The other thing with content, I think that's important, and I did highlight that in my presentation, is the mandatory versus the optional requirements. And I think those are the 2 things to keep in mind. Is it doesn't matter what the format is, because you're interested in the content, and the content is what is mandatory and what is optional. And it could be that with traditional medicine products in China, they have more mandatory reporting of information for botanicals, but that's not the case in the United States. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Actually, well, I have a follow-up naive question.
Okay.
So when the FDA approves a dietary supplement, do they really know what type of cinnamon is getting approved, or how? I'm not sure if you know, or like how well do the regulatory bodies understand or are aware of all of these differences?
So in the United States, dietary supplements don't have to go through an approval process. There is no requirement like in Canada.
Okay.
Like a food product, you can manufacture it and put it on the shelf. There are some what we call notification processes that are required. And if it's a novel or new ingredient that has never been in the food supply, then they need to get that cleared before they can put it in the product. But the product itself, if it lacks any of these quote unquote new dietary ingredients, you can put it on the market tomorrow if you made it in your kitchen today.
Okay. Good to know. Okay, let's see what else is here. So back to the codes. So Matthew is asking, where can users download the entire Unicode system?
That link I gave you, it's in the slides.
Oh, okay.
I think you can go in and download it. And you can just Google Unicodes, and you can find it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll note on that we will be providing just about all the slideshows.
Yes.
And and abstracts.
Yeah, I have everyone's decks.
on the joint food ontology work group underneath presentations folder. So I'll get that out shortly.
Great. And one other quick question from Matthew. Does the FDA Unicode system align with the Codex Alimentarius of the UN FAO WHO?
So it doesn't align with any quote unquote regulatory system. It aligns with the nomenclature systems. So for example, in our abstract, which is also, I can email it to you, but it's also going to be made available to all everybody that's registered for this workshop. So Unicode doesn't really create any nomenclature systems. It uses existing nomenclatures. And we gave an example in the abstract, for example, for iron. For iron, for example, they use the WH's, what's called the Anatomical Therapeutic Chemical Classification System. So that's the system they use. So it's not aligned with the regulatory systems, but with the nomenclature systems. I think they're also working with Canada, and also they've already started working with EU and Germany. So and remember, this system was created for drugs and not for foods initially. Okay. So you know, it's a mandatory requirement for drugs.
Right. Okay.
And this is part of the whole, you know, global process of creating.
Okay. All right. So I think that's all the questions we have for Leila. Again, if anybody has any burning questions, you know, now's the time. If you haven't had a chance to put them in the doc, speak up. But so thank you very much, Leila. That was fantastic. I think we have a bunch of questions for Amanda now, who I think has lost her internet connection. And Ruth maybe stick handling answering some of these questions. So I see right off the bat that Rob, you have a question for Amanda. Would you like to ask your question?
Okay, so we've had a number of W3C standards, including for provenance, for sensors, and for processes. I was wondering what drove their choice to create their own process ontologies and structures versus adopting the previously available ones.
Oh man, I might have to save this one for Amanda. So I was not involved in that specific thing. It's a good issue to bring up though, and so I'll circle back.
Great.
Sorry about that.
Oh no. James, did you have a question? By that I mean, would you like to read your question?
Right. Yes. So the question is simply, Mixus already had its own little controlled vocabulary in terms of field names and a little bit on the data types. And it seems to me this whole food package has been and ontology showed up in other places like disease, mentioning a disease in a Mixus package, and a few other kinds of ontology choices. But this round of Mixus development has involved sort of recognizing that the ontology community might even create fields for Mixus and assign identifiers. So I was curious about how the FDA's experience with this round of Mixus development sort of differed from previous rounds that didn't involve reaching out more of a dynamic ontology component.
So this is my first experience creating a Mixus package. And so I think with just building on our previous work with Emma with the genome tracker and attempting to extend the pathogen package in an ontological framework, kind of dabbling in that. And through that process, we realized that we really needed to build out the entire sphere around food, you know, the farm to fork environment. We really needed to have ontologies be the core of that. And so just for interoperability across all the different efforts in our foods program at the FDA. That's why we leaned so heavily on it.
Mm-hmm. I guess I can add that, in fact, there weren't a lot of food ontologies about 5 years ago or 8 years ago when the first Mixus round showed up. There weren't many ontologies really well developed. So I'm not surprised that you folks are starting to turn to them now that there's a little bit of maturity, although the development is now fast and furious as well in the ontology world. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So Ruth, I had a quick question. It kind of comes out of some questions that were asked to me. How do we see the mix attributes interacting with the pathogen package that already exists? Specifically, you have isolation source, right?
Yeah.
And then you have all this really nice granular information that's available in mix. Basically, what do you put in the isolation source field, and then what can you add on as extra fields? So
this would be step 2. So our first, I think this was a good order to do things in. Our metagenomic group needs much more granular contextual data to do their analyses, to tweeze out different effects. So I think building this huge package for metagenomic data was a good first step. And then as we look to expand the pathogen package for genome tracker data, this is just pure isolate data, we'll choose the fields that make sense, add them to this new package, decide how we're going to deal with the isolation source field, simplify it drastically, and recommend that users do not put free text in there. Then I think that then you'll be able to move back and forth between the pathogen package and the Mixus metagenomic samples. And so for every metagenomic sample we submit, we'll have isolates and genome tracker that were derived from that.
Do you think eventually the isolation source field will go away in favor of these more granular fields?
I can't imagine it would at NCBI. In pathogen, in the pathogen detection, there's like 500,000 sequences already submitted toward that. And so I think that we'll have to decide how we want to treat that field so that we're interoperable with the folks not using the expanded genome tracker package. I feel like there's too much legacy data to move away from it completely. Although, maybe good communication and harassment from us will shift the dial a little.
Okay, right. So back to the doc. Okay, thanks for that. Where are we now? Matthew, you had a question for Amanda, which I guess is now Ruth. Do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Except I have to find where I was in the document there, because I don't remember what I asked here. Oh yeah. Recently, FDA came out with rules for new sort of proposal for food traceability. Do you see what you're building here, including or being part of a larger system that includes traceable foods, key data elements, critical tracking events, and essentially fitting into this criteria risk ranking model for food tracing and factors that are all part of FSMA?
Yeah, really good question. So we were just talking about this, I think, in our meeting earlier this week. Historically, this more regulatory controlled vocabulary work has been handled in a schema called IFSAC. It's kind of not specifically this new food traceability stuff, but the more regulatory part of it. IFSAC is what's been used for the risk assessment for source attribution, kind of the regulatory arm of the FDA. And so we have just started talking about, really working more closely with that group to try to build out these regulatory terms in the MixX package. I think it makes sense to start to, start with some very basic regulatory fields and build out from there. But yeah, it's a good point it's a good opportunity to add those.
So these development trajectories are happening sort of parallel to each other in terms of the regulatory is kind of doing one thing and the sort of the scientific investigation is doing another. Is that what you're saying right now?
Well, I think the IFSEC is a very mature control vocabulary. It's been around a long time. It's kind of core to a lot of the risk assessment and built into the stuff that CDC is doing, USDA is doing. So our effort on using ontologies to describe food sources stemmed from maybe a little bit more on the research side, but I guess we're attacking it from a different side. Now we're converging.
Right.
The IFSEC group is much more mature than we are. And so we'll just have to figure out how to, I don't want to speak for the IFSEC group, but I feel like if the IFSEC group could move more toward an ontological framework, I think they would really benefit from that. I'm outside of that
for
group,
sure.
and so we'll continue to talk with them, and I think when they see the benefit of using this framework, they'll start to adopt it.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah.
So I had another quick question, and I've said it's for Amanda/Ruth, but it really I think would be for everybody. In that, with developing new standards and starting to apply ontologies, there's always this, issue of going from someone's variable output from their database, however they're capturing information, and moving it towards the standardized structure. And you're gonna need tools for that. That's what, that's one of the pieces that's going to increase compliance. So, how do we start to build these tools that will help people go from their stuff, the way that they, their worldview, into this standardized system? Is it piecemeal? Is it, are we going to have to just invent a million different tools, or like, how do we tackle this? Or is it just a lot of manual curation?
Oh man, it's incredibly complex. So what we are trying to focus on is to shore up the labs submitting data for the Genome Tracker Network. We are designing a kind of a web app validation system. We're going to use your tool LexMapper to attempt to convert a free text field into this IFSEC category and a basic food on term. And as we start to add in these ontological fields from the MixX package, I think we'll have to try to figure out how to extend that. So we, as kind of directors of the Genome Tracker group and funding the labs, we can require them to submit the metadata in a certain format. And my experience with the system is the more, so we have that requirement, we curate the data, ensuring that they meet that requirement. And as people from outside the network start to submit data and they'll start to see that their data isn't matching right, they can't get their trees labeled correctly because they didn't submit to the right field, it starts to, you start to get that carrot when you submit the data in the right format. And that's all we can hope for, right?
I don't know if any of the other speakers or anybody on the line for that matter has any opinions about this. No?
If I can jump in very quickly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Opinions are the one thing I excel at.
Oh, good.
The problem with the ontologies is they're extremely complicated, and they're not for the mortal man. whereas a front end fixes one single problem and it fixes it well. So I think the suggestion of saying we have multiple little applications that do one thing well within a specific context, and that application can pull in all of that other complexity of the ontology while hiding it from the user. So I think that you should focus on a single thing, fix the specific problem of the person, and then behind the scenes integrate with all of this ontological complexity so that everybody can have aligned data. But you can't, trying to do too much in one application is just a recipe for disaster.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, so where are we now? Oh yeah, right. So I see that Fernanda has had to go, so I'm afraid we won't get to the questions for her, which is a shame. But we only have a few minutes left in the session anyway. So one of the questions that I had, and probably, again, this is for Amanda and Ruth, but probably I can address it to everybody, is, there's an issue of data capture. So what folks are doing upstream. There's an issue of data structure. So, coming up with standards and using ontologies. And then there's the issue of data sharing, right? And all of these things need improvements. So are there dissemination plans or activities for the new mix packages to get users to do all of these things better? I guess how do you get people to use the standard, and then how do you improve their upstream data capture? And then, because we've seen lots of times where people will just say that a sample is from a chicken or something, right? That's not detailed enough for anybody to use it. So how do you say, okay, well, is it retail chicken? Is it from Kentucky Fried Chicken? Is it like, what is it? And then they've got to structure it in this standard, and then they have to share it, because they may have collected it, they may be able to structure it, but then they don't share it with you, and they just say missing, or they say food, or they say something like that. So I think in the creation of a standard, you have a lot of momentum where you can affect change. So how do we do that?
So on the US level, we are working across all the US agencies that intersect with food in some way. That's called the GenFS Consortium. So that group is aware of that, and I think we'll get buy-in from our US partners. We also have an international working group working on this mixed package, and so I hope that the in-country representatives working on that package will help us in that area. I mean, all we can do is announce it at meetings, publish using that standard, showing the kinds of questions we can ask and hypotheses we can test using structured metadata in that way. Hoping the NMDC group at Lawrence Livermore can help us to just get the word out about the importance of metadata and metagenomics and genomics in general. I don't know. It's a good question.
Did you put in an abstract for ASM NGS? I'm thinking of venues where this can be discussed. Anyway, don't mean to put you on the spot, but yeah, I think I put
an abstract in for another project I'm working on. But yeah.
Oh, right. So I don't know if anybody on the phone has any thoughts about that. Improving data capture upstream, and how to get people to structure their data. Obviously, Rob has mentioned you can just give them a drop-down menu and they just have to use it. But then also data sharing. So how do we get people to share their data?
May I ask another but related question, which I put in the chat, but you didn't get to?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, please do.
So that was, how would you integrate blockchain technology with ontology development?
So I don't know, James, if maybe you want to handle this. I know we've been talking to a startup company that was looking at using blockchain for tracing food freshness. So they would have sensors at all the different stages, from production through transportation to when the food reaches, I guess, a shop. And then at any point when food started to get a little bit, you know, too close to being ripe, that would use blockchain technology to possibly divert that crate of tomatoes or whatever to someone who could make tomato sauce out of it instead of selling it to a grocery store where the requirements for freshness is different. But I don't know, Dames, if you wanted to expand on that a little bit.
Just a little. So the blockchain is all there to address trust relationships between suppliers and distributors and consumers. And so it was layered on top as a bunch of transactions that people could have confidence in and distributed. So you can actually layer that on traditional SQL pick list tables and anything. I think what we'd be looking for is a confluence that the ontologies do such a great job at providing these little metadata packets that blockchain just uses those in its little ledger transactions to as a template. So it's this idea of enabling a software platform to create little little models of how a transaction should look in terms of its metadata, and that can then just be written off as a little jQuery or a JSON, little JSON packet of data to add to a transaction. So that's the one direction we were going in with the project we were calling GEAM, which was just to make it a lot easier for ontologists to put into a JSON or some other data standard the vocabulary and little mini structure that held it together, talking about a biosample or something like that. At any rate, so blockchain can be layered on all of these agricultural transactions, whether they be with little ontology terms or not.
Great, thanks. Does anybody else have any other questions that they'd like to ask before we close out? No? Okay. So once again, thank you to all the fabulous speakers today and for all our fabulous question answerers as well. I think this has been a really great discussion. As mentioned, the slide decks will be posted online for everybody, so you can get the links. You can follow up on this information. I think the recordings will be posted as well. This is the third out of 4 sessions, so please make sure to tune in next week for the 4th and final session. Thank you all for participating and asking such great questions. Participate in Tarini's food experiment. The details of that are coming. And have a great rest of the day. Thanks very much. And don't hesitate to get in touch. If you got friends who are interested in food ontologies, hook them up, let us know. And thanks to everybody. Have a great day.
Right. And for those who had questions for Fernanda Doria, she had to leave the meeting early, but you can email her directly and we can supply that email address.
Can you guys just keep the session open for a minute so people can save the chat and stuff, because there's private conversations happening too. If you jump it, then people lose all that.
Yeah,
yep.
Sure, for sure.
Thanks.
I'll put Fernanda's email. I'll put Fernanda's email in the chat right now.
Great. Okay, I'm going to pause the recording.